Second half of 1945. Now that the war in Europe is over, it's time for a transition to a life in peace, an end to the war against humanity, the beginning of a time to rise above, to be better than your enemy, to take the high road, forgive and reconcile. Or maybe this is the story of the largest forced population transfer so far in human history. This is a legacy documentary of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. As the war was still raging, we saw the opening stages of the expulsion of the German populations of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Central European countries the spring and summer of 1945. Those considered German by the Nazis and now by their countrymen, the Volksdeutsche in Nazi phraseology, are curled into internment camps, thrown out of their homes and sent forth on forced marches. Germans are beaten, robbed, raped, and executed. We left the story with the testimony of a 25-year-old mother dispatched on one of those marches from Poland towards Germany. Other Germans are packed onto freight wagons and dispatched westward by train on 2-week journeys to Berlin. In our freight wagon, there were about 98 people, and it's no exaggeration to say that we were squeezed against each other like sardines in a can. When we reached Allenstein, people started to die and had to be deposited along the side of the rails. One or more dead bodies greeted us every morning. Recriminations and quarrels erupted, even attempts to exchange blows in the middle of this human scrum. The very sick suffered the worst. Typhus was widespread throughout the entire transport, and the numbers of deaths grew with each passing day. You can well imagine the state of hygiene that prevailed in the wagons. By July 1945, some 550,000 expelled Germans are deposited in Berlin. When Western journalists arrive in the city to cover the Potsdam Conference, they find themselves at the epicenter of a rapidly worsening humanitarian crisis, as train after train disgorges its cargo of dead and dying Germans. An officer in the parachute regiment reports home to the Foreign Office in London that thousands of people are dying by the roadside from starvation, dysentery, and exhaustion. As he puts it, even a cursory visit to the hospitals in Berlin, where some of these people have dragged themselves, is an experience which would make the sight in the concentration camps appear normal. These new Berliners find themselves dumped in a broken city, struggling with an acute housing shortage brought about by Allied bombing. They also face a hostile reception from the native-born population, who refer to the new arrivals from Poland as Wasserpolaken, or water Polacks, a pejorative term for Silesians. Rucksackdeutsche, backpack Germans, 40-kilo gypsies on account of their luggage allowances, or simply as Russians. Some absurdly blame the Volksdeutsche for having started the war. At the Potsdam Conference, Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union issue a call that the remaining Volksdeutsche should be expelled in what they call an orderly and humane way. Primarily, the four powers are concerned about the economic and logistical strain of accepting this chaotic flood of human traffic into their zones of occupation in Germany. In response, the Czechoslovak government does cut down on the number of Germans it sends to the border. Perhaps mainly because the Soviets start returning the expulsion trains and dumping the Germans back on Czechoslovak soil. But there are ways around this. Prague sends more and more Germans through under the facade of voluntary migration or as supposed agricultural workers seeking work in Germany. For their part, the Poles pay little heed to the Potsdam Declaration and continue throwing Germans out on foot and by rail. The German Communist Party, the KPD, assists in organizing trains westward. In Yugoslavia, Josip Tito begins the process of expelling Germans from his new state. Unlike the Poles and Czechoslovaks, the Allies have not given him permission to do so. But by using violence, subterfuge, and by exploiting gaps in the borders with Austria and Hungary, the trains and refugee columns continue heading north from Yugoslavia. This whole period from May 1945 into the autumn of 1945 becomes known as the time of wild expulsions. But is this really a fitting description? Such a term implies spontaneous mob action driven from below, and yes, in some cases, the violence and expulsions do follow this pattern. The May Days in Prague and the Brno Death March we saw during our chronological coverage are clear examples. But the vast majority of the expulsions, along with the persecution, beatings, executions, rapes, and imprisonment in camps, is sanctioned, organized, and executed by the forces of the Polish, Czechoslovak, and Yugoslav states. The whole idea of wild expulsions is a convenient narrative fiction that lets these governments off the hook for a rapid program of brutalization. Efforts to quantify these months are difficult. Beyond lacking accurate record keeping, there is also the usual uncertainty over who counts as a German, a Pole, or a Czech. On top of that, tracking these movements is made harder because before the German surrender, German refugees had already begun making their way from Poland into German-occupied Czechoslovakia. For the numbers we do have, the Red Army estimates that at least 775,000 Germans are expelled from Czechoslovakia to the Soviet occupation zone by December 12, 1945. This figure could be as high as 800,000. For Poland, numbers are even harder to come by, but estimates are between 700,000 and 1 million displaced. Deaths in this period run into several tens of thousands at least. But this whirlwind of violence cannot continue indefinitely. The Czechoslovak and Polish governments anticipate further restrictions on the chaotic expulsions if they threaten to overwhelm the Allied occupation authorities in Germany. And from the perspective of Prague and Warsaw, this very chaos has already served a useful purpose, demonstrating to the Allies what the worst-case scenario looks like. This means the four powers can no longer wash their hands of the whole thing, leaving the Czechoslovak and Polish governments in a strong negotiating position to negotiate a method for expelling Germans that is theoretically more formal and humane. Eventually, the six governments sit down, draw up some rules at a meeting of the Allied Coordinating Committee in Berlin in autumn 1945. This meeting also deals with the problem of the German minority in Hungary. Unlike in Poland and Czechoslovakia, there is no mass hatred of Germans in Hungary. After all, Hungary was allied to Germany. At present, Hungary has a provisional government which operates under the direction of a Soviet-dominated Allied Control Commission. This government is led by Prime Minister Béla Dalnoki Miklós, a Hungarian army general who had defected to the Soviets in late 1944, and it is a coalition of the Independent Smallholders Party, the Hungarian Social Democratic Party, the National Peasant Party, and the Hungarian Communist Party. Of these four parties, it is only the communists who support the expulsions of the Germans. In the end, it is decided to expel some, but not all, of Hungary's German population. The final agreement, approved on November 20, 1945, sets out a time frame for expelling the remaining Germans and gives quotas for each Allied zone in Germany. The Soviets agreed to take approximately 2.75 million people, the US 2.25 million, Britain 1.5 million, France 150,000. Deportations are to begin in December. The Allied preparations for embarkation, transport, reception, assimilation, and housing are inadequate for an estimated total of almost 7 million people. It also makes no account of expulsions from countries other than Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary. But the agreement does achieve one central and perhaps cynical objective: to reassure the Western public that the process will become more humane. The deportation process continues for the next few years. It is certainly somewhat more orderly, but hardly more humane. The death toll continues to rise. Expulsions are complete from Czechoslovakia by October 1946, by which point approximately 1.7 million Germans have been expelled to the American zone and another 1 million to the Soviet zone. This is added to the 700,000 or 800,000 expelled during the wild expulsions and the tens of thousands of voluntary migrants. The Czechoslovak government allows 250,000 German speakers to stay. In Poland, expulsions and immigration continues until 1950. Most estimates give a figure of about 3.1 million people who leave the country. Several 100,000 Germans are retained either as essential specialists or as forced laborers in Poland or the Soviet Union. The Polish government deems 1 million Germans fit for Polonization, and they are renaturalized as Polish citizens by 1950. In Hungary, expulsions are complete by June 1948. By that point, somewhere in the region of 200,000 to 250,000 Germans have been expelled or migrated west or deported to the Soviet Union for labor. About 270,000 German speakers remain in Hungary, including German-speaking Jews. In Romania, 100,000 Germans fled westward with the German armed forces in the autumn of 1944, during and after the Romania surrender to the Soviet Union and defection to the Allies. Of those remaining, somewhere in the region of 60,000 to 100,000 are deported to the Soviet Union for labor in January 1945. About 10,000 of these deportees will die on the journey or in the labor camps. This leaves a German population of about 400,000 in Romania by the end of 1945. In Yugoslavia, about 200,000 ethnic Germans remain at the end of the war. Mass shootings and other atrocities killed about 7,000 people, while some 25,000 to 30,000 ethnic Germans are deported to the Soviet Union for labor. With the men fighting in the German army or already executed, some 90% of these deportees are young women. Most of the Germans remaining behind, that's somewhere between 160 and 170,000, have been imprisoned in squalid labor camps. Somewhere in the range of 50,000 Germans die in these camps by the time they are closed in March 1948. By 1950, most of Yugoslavia's surviving German speakers have left the country. All in all, according to the sources we have consulted for this video, and taking into account those who are given permission to stay in their countries in late 1940s, early 50s, that gives somewhere in the region of 7.5 million Germans expelled after the war. Again, this is simply the best estimate we can give with the incomplete data we have. Add to this the evacuation conducted by the German government in the later stages of the war, the voluntary migration, whether truly free or coerced, as well as deportations for labor, and at least 12 million Germans and German speakers have left Central Europe, Yugoslavia, Kaliningrad for Germany by 1950. Even with the guns silent and the deportation trains halted, the battle over the accounting of suffering will continue. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, this historiographical war is fought between historians, governments, interest groups representing the German refugees and political parties. Before even coming to the various ideological viewpoints held by these groups, the simple fact is that counting human movements, persecution, and death on this scale is difficult, especially given the chaotic nature of the expulsions. Questions abound, such as how many Germans were on Polish or Czechoslovak soil before, during, and after the war? What counts as an expulsion and who counts as an expellee? How many deaths or murders are recorded? Who is responsible for the death of an expelled German thrown on a train in Poland who then dies in an overwhelmed Berlin hospital? In 1958, the West German government will claim that 2.2 million Germans are killed in the post-war persecution and expulsions, a figure supported by the German Red Cross and by most Western historians, at least until the end of the Cold War. Post-1990, the reunified German government will maintain the figure of 2.2 million, but by then the claim has been complicated by the release in 1989 of a previously classified study by the West German Federal Archives. Completed in 1974, this study proposes a significantly lower figure of 600,000 deaths. However, this only counts those who were killed outright by violent acts and mistreatment during the expulsions. It does not take into account those who died of malnutrition or disease or who died later as a result of mistreatment. It also does not give any figures for Germans from Romania and Hungary. In the early 2000s, a newer generation of German historians will propose figures in the range of 500 to 600,000, with some estimates going as high as 750,000. While some Polish and Czech historians give estimates in the range of 400,000, the issue has become a sore point between the German and Central European historians. For example, a joint commission of Polish and Czech historians gave extremely low estimates of between 15 to 30,000 people when studying the issue in 1995. Unfortunately for us, it is unlikely that there will ever be agreement on the issue. As I have shown, the mathematics of human misery are inherently difficult, which forces the question if suffering is quantifiable in the first place. What point are numbers when we can't agree on the underlying principles of decency? As long as we can't agree to stop the hatred, there will always be another victim, another perpetrator, and another atrocity. As long as we claim that they must take the first step, we will stand still. As long as we refuse to understand that they are us, we will continue to cut into our own flesh and sacrifice it to the gods of strife and suffering. As long as we perpetuate the madness of our own chauvinism and do not begin to care for the stranger, even our perceived enemy, somewhere out there, one corpse after another will be added to the garden of bones where we have built the glass house that is our conscience. Never forget.